Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Sí. Lo primero, gracias por asistir a esta sesión académica que hemos organizado con el profesor David Hansen, que es una sesión, en primer lugar, abierta a todo el público, al público de la Facultad de Educación, pero al público en general. Somos una universidad pública, así que estamos encantados de recibir a quienes participan de la comunidad educativa en su sentido más extenso en este tipo de actividades. Esta actividad también es una sesión inaugural del Máster en Estudios Avanzados en Educación Social, que es uno de los máster de esta Facultad de Educación. Todos los años solemos hacer una sesión inaugural, invitamos a un ponente y en este caso tenemos la suerte de tener con nosotros al profesor David Hansen. Esta sesión va a ser una sesión en inglés. Y yo sé que esto es un pequeño esfuerzo que tenemos que hacer todas y todos, y yo voy a ser el primero en hacer el esfuerzo. Then I'm gonna talk in English. It's gonna be nice for all people here to practice English today, to listen, to speak, to participate in a debate. And of course, I think it's easier when someone who is not a native speaker, that is my case, try to speak in English just to break the ice to some extent and to see that it doesn't matter if you commit mistakes speaking English or you have an accent or whatever. The important thing is try to share your ideas, your comments, your thoughts in this session. I want to introduce this session saying thank you to Professor David Hansen for being here with us. We consider that this is a privilege, that is a nice opportunity for this Faculty of Education to have scholars participating and sharing with us their research and the results of their work. As I said in Spanish, this is an opening session for the Master in Advanced Studies in Social Education. We have here many students that right now in this semester are starting the Master, but this is also a public academic session. We are very happy to see this room full. I'm a little bit worried because if more people want to be here, we are going to have problems. But, you know, I can see that there are other places in which the people can be accommodated to some extent. But, as I said, this is a public session. We were talking with David how to organize this session. And what we decided is that we are going to have different parts in this academic session. First of all, we will have the opportunity to hear David with a presentation that will take around 30-40 minutes. You will see that David will try to speak slowly to be clear speaking English. I remember when the first time I had the opportunity to hear David in a presentation, I remember that it was possible to follow the ideas and so on because he usually speaks very slow and very clear, and that's really, really great when you are not a native speaker and sometimes you could have difficulties with English. Later on, we will have a discussion about the ideas and thoughts of David's presentation, and it will be the opportunity for the audience to participate, to deliver comments and so on. It's going to be very simple, the organization of this session. Laura Camas will be as a discussant here, organizing the different turns for people who want to speak. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, David, for being here. Thank you, Laura, for being as a discussant. And thank you to the audience and the people who decided to spend this afternoon with us. And it's time to start, Laura.
Thank you so much, John, for this warm welcome. And before we start, I would like to introduce Professor David Hansen. For those who don't know me, I'm Laura Camas. I'm professor at the Department of Educational Studies. John and I, we both are in the same research group, and we work together. And yes, so let's start with this introduction. It is my honor to introduce Professor David Hansen. He is professor at the Teachers College at Columbia University in the city of New York. Professor Hansen is one of today's most respected voices in the field of philosophy of education. His scholarship explores the moral, ethical, and human dimension of teaching, with a special emphasis on the teacher's present and the vocation to teach. He has served as president of both the Philosophy of Education Society and the John Dewey Society, and in 2025 he was elected a member of the National Academy of Education. His most recent book, Reimagining the Call to Teach, A Witness to Teachers and Teaching, reflects this same spirit, a renewal of his classic The Call to Teach, inviting us to sustain our vocation as educators in changing times while preserving the dignity and humanity at the heart of teaching. Actually, this is a very, very formal presentation, but let me introduce to David Hansen in another way. The first time I saw David Hansen, I was master's student here at this faculty. Professor Gonzalo Jover, the actual dean of the faculty, had invited him to give a lecture in 2016. Who would have thought that 5 years later, I will go on a research stay at the Teachers College, joining his program, Philosophy and Education. Since then, we have been in touch and become, I would say, good friends. Let me introduce David with an anecdote that I believe captures many of the themes he will speak about this afternoon. When I first visited his program, David asked me to write a brief description or introduction of my educational interest. On the opening day of the program, he gave a humble, warm, and hospitable welcome to all students of the program. He carefully introduced each student to other publicly, using these descriptions. In that moment, it was easy to sense that we were embarking on a new beginning together, for sure. Something that I believe he will elaborate on today. Please join me in warmly welcome Professor David Hansen.
Gracias, Laura. That's really a nice introduction. And buenas tardes a todas y todos. It's a pleasure to be here. And my apologies for having to speak with you today in English, because my Spanish is very minimal. But I can say this. Muchas gracias, Professor John Ilhelmo, por la invitación para compartir y presentar algunos de mis pensamientos sobre la enseñanza. Mil gracias también a profesora Laura Camas por su ayuda con traducción de algunos de mis términos. So from time to time in this presentation, I'm going to share the Spanish equivalent of some of the English terms I'll be using. What I want to do is to talk with you about a concept, an idea, that I believe sheds dramatic light on teaching and on what it means to be a teacher. The concept is being with, ser con in Spanish, being with. I'll begin by discussing how several philosophers have worked with this idea, and then with this background, I'll describe why the concept, being with, ser con, in my view, points to both the center and the circumference of teaching. Cercón como el centro y la circunferencia de la enseñanza. So the first part is called the ontology of being with, and you have a handout, I think it was on most of the chairs. So I'm going to, part one is going to be these ideas, and you can see some of the English terms. I'll offer some of the Spanish as well as we proceed. So the ontology of being with. So several well-known philosophers have worked with this idea of being with through the lens of what is called ontology, ontología. This term describes the study of what we might think of as our primordial being, which is to say the sheer fact that we exist in the first place, that we are here rather than not here. Every culture the world over, across human history, and every child who has ever lived has confronted the fact that there is something rather than nothing. That the universe in which we live is not an empty void, but is in fact filled with countless entities like we human beings. Cultures and children alike do not always express their wonder, asombro, do not always express their wonder at their sheer existence. The confrontation I mentioned is often not cognitive at all, non-cognitivo, but rather a matter of feeling, a kind of felt awe, surprise, astonishment. It's kind of like, wow, I have a hand. Small children do that. Sometimes even adults may wonder about this. Children later learn that religion emerged in human culture, at least in part, as an attempt to grasp the sheer fact of our existence and to be thankful for it as a kind of gift, our hands and everything else. And as we know, religions bring forth notions of the creators of our existence, and these creators are typically called God or gods. Children also later learn that science can, in fact, explain the hand, its evolutionary development over time, that it is made of various muscles and other tissues, and so forth. But science cannot tell us why this thing called a hand exists. Cannot tell us why we have this thing called a hand. Science can help us understand what it is, lo que es. Science can help us understand what it is, but not that it is. Ser, or what the philosopher Martin Heidegger calls sometimes ser en el mundo, being in the world. The same limitation holds for religion as it does for science. We can picture a powerful God or a group of gods who created everything, but who created God and who created the gods? And how could the very idea of creating come into this cosmos, this universe? So all of this points to the question of being, ser itself. Our very grammar in our language gestures toward it. To be, ser. Precisely, what is it to be at all? Of course, we cannot answer the question of how the idea of creating came into our universe, any more than we can answer why there is something called evolution, or why there are atoms and molecules. And so we are thrown back again and again to the beginning, comienzo, in a spirit of wonder, de asombro. And what we can say about this beginning is that we are here before any and all awareness of being here. We are always here before any and all awareness or reflective consciousness that we are here. Several philosophers who have worked with this idea of being with, cercón, try to capture the immediacy of our existence, that our primary or first experience is always pre-cognitivo, always responsive to what is around us, even though we are typically totally unaware of the immediacy of our experience, of our responsiveness. We can never stop time and ask, what is going on in this very second? Because when we ask that question, we're into the next second, and the next second, and the next second. In short, we are always already responding to being here in the world. Language can never catch up with the immediacy of our being. So these remarks underscore why philosophers use the term with, the term con. We are always already with others and the world before we can so much as think or begin to differentiate. We are always and already with others in the world, even when we perhaps reject the world, or reject other people, or even reject ourselves, or reject anything. We are still always already with. It is the very constitution of our being, of what it means to be here at all. Again, what I'm talking about is not what we are, not what we think, not what we say, not what we do, but that we are at all. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger, he uses the concept mit sein. That's the German expression for being with. The French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, he works with the concept être avec, which is the French terms for being with, ser con. We might say that Heidegger emphasizes being, while Nancy emphasizes the with. Jean-Luc Nancy especially draws out what I see as ethical implications of how he thinks of the constitution of our being as human beings. If we are always already with others in the world, in other words, with everything that exists before we so much as think about the things that exist, then for human beings to reject other human beings, much less to harm other human beings, in fact runs counter to our fundamental being as the beings that we are. For Nancy, our primary condition is not separation, but there's an English word on your handout here, it's withness. There's no direct translation into Spanish, but for Nancy, our primary condition is not separation, but withness. Una relación continua, or interdependencia mutua, something like that, which does not mean homogeneity or sameness. As Nancy argues, proximity to all other entities, or withness, the English term, depends on the distance that it opens up. It's hard to grasp this idea, but he says that all of being is in touch with all of being, but the presupposition of touching is separation. A very interesting kind of paradox, our fundamental being in the world. Let me take a drink of water here. It's nice and warm in Madrid. In New York City, it's cooler.
Warm welcome.
Now, everything that I've been saying up to now, as you can understand, is quite abstract. Not just in the clouds, las nubes, but maybe beyond las nubes. This appearance, this abstracción, is quite natural, because to try to express what philosophers call our fundamental being is very difficult to do. Many people have tried to do so through other means. For example, through poetry. For example, through music, through dance, through painting and other arts, and also through philosophy. But as I mentioned, this English word, thisness or isness, another word on your handout, isness, la cualidad de ser, o la condición de ser, o ser en mayúsculas, ser en mayúsculas. This quality of our being always outruns our language. It always outruns our language and other modes of expression. Se escapa al, o se adelanta a lenguaje. Sort of outruns our language. We can never catch it. In the very moment of expression, we cannot stop time and motion. We are always already with. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he speaks of what he calls the sorrow of language, la tristeza del lenguaje, that we human beings, we cannot say everything in a single moment that we would like to say. Language is temporal. It's always behind, lags behind our experience. However, and importantly, this fact does not degrade or compromise the expressions that we may put forward, nor does it create a familiar dualism between appearance and reality that goes all the way back to the beginning of philosophy, to someone like Platon, if not before. And here, the word that I have on the handout, the term ontic, ontico, becomes valuable. If the concept ontology, ontologia, if this refers to inquiry into our fundamental being, again, that we are, not what we are. The concept ontico refers to the reality of our lived interactive experience in the world. I can only gaze in wonder at such a thing that I have a hand at all. I can only gaze at wonder that I have a hand. But my hand is real. It is certainly real, very real in all the things that it can do. Put another way, there is no tension between the appearance of my hand and the reality of my hand. No tension at all. There's no hand here and somehow the form of a hand somewhere else, to use Plato's imagery. The concept being with, serkon, does not imply some separate invisible world, but simply refers to what is always already happening, the isness, to use that English word that I've talked about. So, again, as you can see, to try to say something about our fundamental being, our isness, it always seems to inevitably draw us right back up again into the clouds, las nubes, o la tierra de abstracción. So let us come back down to earth. Let's come back down to earth for the rest of this talk and remain on earth and ask, how can a concept like being with shed light on education and the world of the school and the world of the teacher? So in what follows for the rest of this presentation, I'm not going to be referring anymore to ontology, much to your relief, I'm sure. I'm not going to be discussing ontological questions. But as I've tried to illustrate, ontology, or the inquiry into our fundamental being, it begins in wonder. Begins in wonder, asombro, in wonder that we are here at all, and how to make sense of being here at all. So I want to invite you for the rest of the presentation to join me in wondering, a real sense of shared wonder, un sentido de asombro compartido together. Let's share wonder for the rest of the talk at what teaching is, and especially what does it mean to be a teacher. And the theme of wonder, I think, will help us as a kind of background to everything that I'm going to say. So now I'm going to turn to the second part, teaching and being a teacher. There's a long-standing discussion in the fields of philosophy of education, research on teaching, and teacher education regarding the complicated, dynamic question of what is the relationship between teachers and students in their work together? What is the relationship between teachers and students in their work together? And I'm thinking mostly of primary, secondary school teachers. The discussion of this topic has been long-standing because every single teacher confronts the question of relationship the very moment they walk through the door of their classroom. They face it immediately. What will be my relationship with these students? It's an immediate question. Does the relationship, for example, simply come down to discharging the functions of the role of teacher? Is that what it is? Just do the functions of what it means to be a teacher. This perspective, this functional viewpoint, makes a lot of sense. Teachers, after all, are paid to fulfill a social role, to get a particular job completed. And there doesn't seem to be much more to say. Of course, there is much more to say. There's much, much more to say. There's a fundamental limitation in this conception of teaching as merely a social function. A fundamental limitation in this conception of teaching as merely a social function. This limitation is the fact that the conception reduces teaching. It reduces teaching to a generic set of actions. It reduces teaching to a generic set of actions in which teachers basically become interchangeable. Teachers basically become interchangeable, intercambiable. In other words, it doesn't matter who is in the role as long as they're carrying out the functions that are assigned to that role. It doesn't matter who is in the role as long as they're carrying out the functions assigned to that role. Now, every dedicated teacher that I've ever known or read about acknowledges that, of course, there are important functions in being a teacher, important functions in being a teacher. They must teach their subjects effectively, treat their students respectfully. They must assess or evaluate students' work fairly, and in general, responsibly fulfill their duties. But I have never met a dedicated teacher who thinks they are interchangeable with any other teacher. I've never met a dedicated teacher who thinks they can be interchanged with any other teacher. This conviction is not because they think they are special or better than every other teacher, not because they think they're special. On the contrary, the best teachers that I've known are humbled. They feel humbled by how challenging it is to teach well and to be a good teacher to as many students as possible. They feel a lot of humility about how challenging it is to do this. They do not bring arrogance to their role. They bring commitment. They bring dedication. In a book I published some years ago called Exploring the Moral Heart of Teaching, Explorando el Corazón Moral de la Enseñanza, I wrote about what I call tenacious humility, humildad tenaz, as capturing the combination or the fusion of sort of being humble, but also strongly dedicated to the work. Thoughtful teachers seem to bring to bear who they are, the distinctive, singular persons that they are, the human beings that they are. And I mean this in a holistic sense. That is, dedicated teachers seem to bring to the classroom more than their mind and more than their reason or their reasoning ability. They also bring something of the heart, el corazón, something of their feeling for growing young people, something of their feeling for growing young people, their sensitivity about the difficulties that students often encounter in coming to learn a different subject, awareness of the difficulties students will often encounter, as well as awareness of students' successes and the ability to recognize successes. Let me present these points in another way. To judge from all of the research literature and from testimony from many dedicated teachers, they bring to the classroom more than knowledge of the subject matter. They bring more than knowledge of the subject matter. They know that teaching is not a matter of pouring knowledge into students as if they are just empty receptacles. And this is a long criticism, goes back to Plato, Aristotle, Rousseau, John Dewey, Paulo Freire, and many others as well. Dedicated teachers appreciate that the relationship, that important word again, the relationship between teacher, student, and subject matter is dynamic, complicated, and often unpredictable. Often unpredictable. Neither the teacher, nor the student, nor the subject matter, neither the teacher, nor the student, nor the subject matter, considered apart from one another, or even as a whole, is the starting point. The starting point of teaching is being with. Serkon. The starting point of teaching is being with. I approach this idea of being with in teaching in both an ethical and epistemic sense. An ethical and epistemic sense, which can be captured in terms such as, in English, attunement, receptivity, that's receptivity, and responsiveness. Sintonia, apertura, sensibilidad. Attunement, receptivity, responsiveness. The term ethics in this orientation, or this approach, it's different from how the term ethics is used in codes, sort of codes of conduct. It differs from how the word is used in considerations of right and wrong, even though these are important considerations for teachers. Instead, I approach the word ethics, or I understand the word ethics, in a very old, yet also contemporary sense, in which the term has two close meanings together. On the one hand, ethics is what we can call a comprehensive concept, comprehensive idea, that includes aesthetic, moral, intellectual, epistemic meanings or considerations. So to speak of teaching as an ethical practice, which is what I have on the handout here, is to see the work as a kind of whole. The aesthetic, the ethical, intellectual, epistemic, they're all happening same moment. Same moment. They're different dimensions of what's happening in the same moment of relationship, teacher and students. On the other hand, the idea of teaching as an ethical practice immediately points to why the individual person, the individual human being in the role of teacher becomes so important, and why teachers are not interchangeable with each other. Why teachers are not interchangeable, non intercambiable. The claim here is that to teach well implies a continuous endeavor or process. To teach well implies a continuous process of what we can call, and this is on the handout, what we can call ethical self-cultivation. I'm going to say more about this. Ethical self-cultivation. It's kind of like a parallel with the ethical practice of teaching. Ethical self-cultivation for the teacher, the practice of teaching as an ethical practice, working parallel to each other. This juxtaposition or parallel of person and practice, teacher, practice of teaching, implies for the teacher developing more than good instructional techniques, although that is, of course, that's important. More than just good instructional techniques, although that is very important. Rather, it suggests deepening and refining one's aesthetic, moral, and intellectual sensibility. Sort of deepening one's sensibilidad, day by day, moment by moment, with students. This sensibility, it bears directly on what it means to meet students where they are. Meet students where they are, and then help guide them into educational experience with the subject. I have on the handout the term ethos of the teacher. the ethos of the teacher, the spirit of the teacher, the way of the teacher. Again, in this respect, as dedicated teachers would be the first to confirm, every new group of students and every new individual student who comes to them calls out for them, calls out for the teacher to begin again, to begin again. Every new student that the teacher meets, every new group of students that the teacher meets, in a kind of metaphorical way, calls out to them to begin again, in a fresh dynamic sense of those terms. To begin again because no two students are the same. No two groups of students are the same. So there's a spirit of beginning each time. When I was talking about ontology, the ontology of being with, I talked about the idea that to grasp not just what we are, but that we are, not what we are, but that we are, requires sort of going back to the beginning. Why every single moment of our lives is a constant beginning again and again and again. Always a beginning again and again and again, as our being itself emerges continuously. Every moment is original, and every moment, every successive moment originates our being. And so for the teacher, in the lived world that I'm talking about here, there's a very real sense in which the teacher must begin again with each student. If we wanted to speak of an ideal situation or a perfect situation, the ideal would be for the teacher to see every moment in the classroom as a new beginning. But that's an ideal. That's an ideal maybe for gods and goddesses, but we humans have to do our best to take as many moments seriously as we can. But that would be the ideal. And I think this idea is why I've spoken about the sense of wonder. The sense of wonder. If we think of the ideal of every single moment we are beginning again with students, that gives us a sense of wonder about teaching and how amazing teaching can be. Every dedicated teacher that I have met or that I've read about makes very clear that teaching has a kind of, call it an unfathomable verticality. Verticalidad insondable. Because no two students and no two groups of students are the same, there is no end point for the teacher. There's no end for the teacher to learning about the endless range of human nature. There's no end point for the teacher learning again and again and again the incredible range of human nature as they encounter each new student or each new groups of students. Including, as they work with students over time, learning about their own human nature. And when you get old enough, like me, you realize that your human nature is more complicated than you can ever figure out. There's no end to the nature of our human nature. And I think there are, if you think about it, there are comparatively few activities. There's a very small number of activities in which human beings can engage, where at the same time you can help others, you can support others and society itself, because education helps society, and at the same time steadily develop one's own qualities as a person. Very few things like teaching allow for this. Again, in the same moment, helping others, students, to transform, to grow, to learn, and helping yourself as teacher transform and learn, grow. That's one of the things that makes teaching very special. And there's another couple of things that I'm going to talk about at the very end here. These remarks illuminate why what I've called ethical self-cultivation is something that is ongoing if we want to respond well to our students. This self-cultivation is not something undertaken in a purely private way, although reflection in solitude and consulting other sources of insight and inspiration is very important. And I always, when I work with new teachers, it's so important to talk with your peers all the time about the work you're doing. It's important to look at the arts, whatever arts you love, poetry, music, film, painting, whatever. Continuously look for sources of inspiration to keep you company, because teaching is very hard. So you need sources of constant inspiration for yourself as a teacher. And this allows you to continue this ethical self-cultivation. And importantly, this kind of self-cultivation is fundamentally substantiated through the actual interaction with students. That's really where it happens, is in the interaction with students. It's not something that we do before we teach and then apply to teaching. It happens in the very moment of teaching. And this kind of, call it ethical growth, it's not identical with students' growth, but it's the same direction. Not the same as students' growth, but it's the same dirección, same direction. For example, becoming more rather than less attentive to the subject matter and to each other. Becoming more rather than less sensitive to the nuances of subject matter and the nuances of what the rest of us in the classroom say to each other. Becoming more rather than less respectful of the subject and of each other. So teachers and students, they're learning different things, of course, but they're learning in the same direction together. Now, everything that I've been saying so far, I think points to the idea of being with, ser con, as the ethical center and circumference of teaching. Being with, as I've tried to describe it, constitutes or denotes a concernful orientation. It's hard to say that in Spanish. Concernful orientation, full of concern, on the part of the teacher, to the dynamics of the familiar but extraordinary complex relationship of teacher, student, subject matter. I think of this notion of being with as helping teachers, or what it is about is helping teachers turn toward students in a kind of metaphorical sense, turn toward. In Plato, there's a very lovely image of turning the soul, giro del alma, towards goodness. In this sense, it's the teacher turning toward students in a metaphorical sense. So being with, again, in this sense, it begins teaching, it inaugurates teaching moment by moment, and always in the moment. Teaching cannot happen without being with. Teaching cannot happen without being with. Learning can happen because to learn we don't need teachers for many things that we learn. Teaching cannot happen, is my argument, without being with. Okay. Doing okay so far? So far so good. Okay. So I have a few more comments to share. So earlier in this presentation, I talked about qualities of attunement and receptivity and responsiveness, sintonía, apertura, sensibilidad, on the part of the teacher. Attunement, let me say something about attunement, sintonía. It denotes a kind of radar-like awareness, el radar, a kind of radar-like awareness of students' responses, student responses to the subject matter, to the teacher, and to one another. To use another image, the best teachers seem to have highly sensitive antennae, antenas de sensibilidad, sort of very amazing sort of antenas that reach out into the environment of the classroom to detect even the smallest of gestures on the part of students, the smallest gestures of students. Between being with, ser con, and what we call in English reflective practice. The relationship between being with and reflective practice. Enseñanza pensativo, if you wish. This relationship has been a topic of research in teaching and teacher education for many years, literally for decades. The image of a teacher as a reflective practitioner continues to be quite important. It's important for many good reasons. As we know, reflection is vital both before and after teaching. Reflection is very important before and after teaching. Nobody who cares about the work questions the importance of reflecting well on what to teach, how to teach it, and why teach it in the first place. Nobody questions the value of reflecting after the fact, of reflection after the class is over, to reflect on what went well and what we may do better the next time round. Moreover, there are countless spontaneous moments in the classroom for reflection in the very midst of teaching. As the teacher, for example, contemplates how to respond to a student's question, or as they observe how the students are working together in groups, or as they deliberate how to resolve a dispute between two students. In a broad sense, reflective teaching is indispensable for implementing what are variously called civic education or moral education, or any kind of education where we're trying to influence hearts and minds. In the absence of reflection and of inquiry and of questioning, these kinds of programs can transform into indoctrination if we're not being reflective about what we're doing. In addition, to move our experience from the precognitive, from the immediate, the precognitive to the cognitive, implies reflection, reflecting on our experience. And this point is worth underlying or stressing in light of the idea that being with as the center of teaching is the main thing. Being with is the main thing upon which a teacher can rely. It's the main thing upon which a teacher can rely in the actual moment-by-moment work with students, because nobody else and nothing else can replace the teacher's own sensitivity and responsiveness and receptivity. It's the main thing to rely upon, this capacity of being with. The spontaneous actions of students to what is happening, they're kind of like pointers, or they're signals to the teacher of what needs attention, as contrasted with merely passing along information. And I'm not saying that the teacher can operate with an unreflective reliance upon their powers of perception or receptivity. On the contrary, reflection upon that which we rely upon as teachers, reflection on what we're relying upon, is an ongoing element in the practice of good teaching. But here's the main point I'm trying to make. Here's the center point I've tried to make. Reflection is not the decisive element in teaching. Reflection is not the decisive point or event in teaching. Not the decisive event in teaching. At the heart of the work, again, is being with. For what happens there gives reflection its fundamental purpose and its deep meaning. What happens in the immediate world of teacher and student, that relationship, is what gives reflection its identity, its importance, its significance. Put another way, given the immersive and the, if I can call it this, pre-theoretical or atheoretical aspects of being with, reflection is not a movement towards something foundational. reflection is not a movement towards something foundational. In fact, reflection can become distracting. It can become distracting, if not pointless, or even damaging. It can even become damaging if it is not guided, if reflection is not guided by a felt sense, a strong felt sense, sensación sentida, a felt sense of the distinctive reality of students, the distinctive reality of students in their interaction with one another. And this felt sense derives from, or I would say is, this felt sense is attunement, receptivity, responsiveness. So another way to say the same thing, this felt sense for the classroom, which guides reflection. If that's not guiding reflection, reflection may become distracting or just wrong for where the students are. It's more than appreciating what students know and don't know about the topic at hand, important as that is. It's more than respecting students' background knowledge, or what can be called their cultural knowledge, all of which is valuable to connecting students with subject matter, as well as connecting them with questions of society. Attunement, receptivity, responsiveness are central to opening oneself up as a teacher, central to opening oneself up as a teacher, to the potentially continuous disclosure or expression of their students' humanity. Let me say that again. Attunement, receptivity, responsiveness, or what I've called this felt sense, are central to opening oneself up as a teacher to the potentially continuous disclosure or expression of their students' humanity. They're teaching human beings, not objects. So that this disclosure, this emergence of their students' humanity. And thereby it positions teachers to truly be there with their students. Or we can say in English, be there truly. Truly be there truly. Both. Be really present with their students. Conclusion. In this presentation, I began with comments about ontology, ontologia, about our fundamental being in the world. The extraordinary fact that we are here, not just what we are. I did so in order to invite all of us into a kind of shared wonder, asombro, that we might feel when we wonder about our very existence. I strongly believe that a sense of wonder about teaching can help guard us against one-sided rationalistic and instrumental notions of the work. Strong sense of wonder about teaching can help protect us against rationalistic views of what teaching is about. As I've claimed, teaching is not primarily a reflective practice. Even though reflection is important, teaching is not primarily a reflective practice. It is primarily an endeavor of engagement, of immersion, immersión, of being with, cercón. Put a different way, teaching is not primarily a matter of solving problems. Teaching is not primarily a matter of solving problems. Although, of course, solving problems when they happen is important, and every teacher will try to solve problems when they happen. But problems in the classroom, with the subject matter or relationship of students, they emerge against a background of a continuous, ongoing, dynamic educational life or educational relationship in the classroom. In other words, when a problem is solved in the classroom does not end. It carries on, maybe with some fresh energy, but the class carries on, it carries on, it carries on. But if you contrast this with going to a doctor or a lawyer or a social worker, when the problem is solved, the relationship is over. Or in many cases, it's over. You may see the doctor again 6 months later, but for now, it's over. But when you solve a problem in the classroom, the relationship is not over. You begin again, again, and again. And so to appreciate, I think, this reality, I think it calls upon the teacher to keep alive, as I've tried to say many times in this lecture, to keep alive their sense of wonder. Muchas gracias for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, David, for this wonderful share wonder talk. Now we have some time to probably make questions, comments. I don't know, like I can start probably saying some ideas that I have that I can. I don't know. I would like to bring it to the table. First of all, when you sent me the paper, because I read it before, and I read the title. It was about the center and the circumference of teaching. So my first thought was, what is this? Is it like the pi number of teaching? So it really kind of moved me to think, oh, here is something kind of interesting in terms of the position that we are going to kind of have after reading the paper, right? And I really would like to say that I will say that this concept of being with, it's super powerful to me. I think it's super inspiring, especially considering the kind of polarized society that we are right now, the populist times we are facing too, with a lot of kind of ideas regarding migration, reporting people, right? So this sense of being with, I think it's a very important in teaching, in education in general, and to me it has like a kind of political implication, right? The term that you brought us today. So thanks for that, first of all. And also I really want to appreciate that you bring to the table this kind of criticism to the notion of teaching like as a kind of technician, as a person that can be replaced. And I really appreciate you came with this idea that teaching is something that had to be renewed and self-cultivated every day, in every single moment, even you say, every gesture of students, there is an opportunity to kind of begin again, right? I think that's so important because, at least I would say in our country, here in Spain, we have this kind of popular discourse on the issue that I want to have my lecture or my class prepare, always prepare, structure for the next day, structure for the next year. Even I have heard some colleagues that are happy to have the same course in the same year so they can teach the same. So this notion of beginning again, of self-cultivating yourself together with your students, not in an isolated way, but with them, and kind of cultivating it through arts, through poetry, through music, it's really inspiring, I have to say. And it really talks to a situation that I think we are also facing here in Spain. And lastly, I think that this idea of teaching in present of human being, right? So it's also talking about this criticism to this reduced notion of what the teachers have to do in class. And I really appreciate this notion of strong felt sense, because it really talks about the teaching is something that had to be contextualize and had to be aware of the everyday life of the class. That means that I could do some plan, but the way in which my class is going to change in a way, because once that I know my student, I can kind of give more details to how we are going to learn something, because I know them more again and again, right? So I just wanted to kind of highlight it, these 3 points that were crucial for me in your lecture.
Thank you, Laura. Maybe a brief response, and then I'd love to hear questions and comments from all of you. But one comment is, the center and circumference, the mathematical terms. It's really fun, I think, to think about them. You know, the spaces, the space in the classroom, the shapes of our relationships. There's really interesting mathematical terms that kind of open it up even more to our pedagogical imagination. And the other thing about the context of the polarized world and difficulty, I mentioned the philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy. He's written a book, I think in Spanish it would be Ser, Singular y Plural. And the very first page of his book is about the crises in the world at the time when he wrote the book in the 1990s. And then he goes into this ontology, much more abstract than I did, to try to state the point that we are always with. And we find, unfortunately, negative creative ways to break that withness. But I think there is, at the end of the day, there's always a political ramification of the ways we teach and educate. And so I think Zircon is a way to think of a kind of politics that would be much more humane, I think, much more humane. And I won't say more, except I have several doctoral students who are really interested in thinking about how what teachers and students accomplish in their classroom can become a kind of model for society itself. So love to hear any questions or comments. Should we open it up again? It's okay in Spanish too, because I have a friend here who will translate for me.
I can translate. I can do my best.
Soy porque somos, so I am because we are.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful. Second, about I would like to hear your thoughts about education and artificial intelligence, because for me it was very impactful. You say that teaching, unlike learning, cannot happen without the sense of being with. So I think AI has brought to us like a lot of freedom, like a possibility of being free of the formal parts of education, like planning, programming, evaluating, so on. So I wonder if would it be the right way then, teaching how to learn first, so that we can be free of the learning process, and we can dedicate more time to this ethical practice of teaching.
I need to say the question in English since we are recording the session, and since you don't have a microphone, I have to like shortly say.
Okay.
So, first question is about what is the relationship between Ubuntu and David notions of being with. Second question is about the relationship between this being with and artificial intelligence. We can leave it there.
Okay. What is your name? Juan. Okay. Gracias, Juan, for your question. First, Ubuntu. Oh, it's a beautiful concept. And it demonstrates that this idea of being with, Zircon, I'm using English or Spanish, but it's cross-cultural. if you look at Eastern religions and Eastern philosophies, I think there are really interesting similarities, some differences, but similarities with this notion of being with. And the Ubuntu is, I am because we are. Kind of, yeah, it's a very beautiful image. I do see close connections. In fact, I teach courses on Africana philosophy of education, and we've played with Ubuntu quite a bit. Very rich idea. Artificial intelligence. Help! What a topic today. What a topic today. Coming down so fast on all of us. Nobody knows the upshot. Nobody knows the ultimate consequence of this. I simply would say this one. I do not imagine how artificial intelligence will ever engage us in Sercon, or being with. I don't see how a machine, however sophisticated it is, can bring together the aesthetic, the heart, the mind, the spirit, the aesthetic, the moral, the intellectual. And machines can do a very good job of instructing. I do not think they can teach. They can instruct. I do not think they can teach. And it's more than a semantic difference. Being a teacher is something that's very rich, very deep, goes so far back in history. Think of our very first teachers. None of us could be teachers today without the thousands of years of teachers on this planet of ours. I can't imagine a non-human agency is going to ever replace that human agency. That's my own particular viewpoint, but I would invite all of us to really think carefully about this. Each of us is going to have to. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It was very inspiring. While listening, I was thinking about make self-cultivation be done through mindfulness or other practices that enhance responsiveness, awareness, and attentive sensitivity. And because in the Buddhist practice of meditation, this difference between reaction and response is clearly stated. So, as long as you enhance your ability to be in the present moment, you become more able to respond to what happens in the present instead of react.
Yeah.
So, short translation for this recording session. So, what is the relationship between mindfulness practices and being with? How do you say?
And what is your name?
Gabriel.
Gabriel. Gracias, Gabriel. Yeah, that's a nice relationship to think about concepts of mindfulness, meditation, maybe contemplation. It's another close word there as well. And you're right that those are wonderful terms that stand for this notion of being present, being as full in the present as we can. And it reminds me of a certain Stoic idea from the ancient Stoics, Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and many other figures, who talk about what we can control. And what we can control is how we're trying to be in the present moment. We cannot control the past, we cannot control the future, but we can be present and bring who we are into action in the present moment. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, he wrote a book called The Shortness of Life. I don't know how you say that in Spanish, but the shortness of life. What he means is that we shorten our lives because we worry so much about the future, or we dwell so much on the past that we're not living in the present. We shorten our own lives. So it's a very powerful notion, Gabriel, and I think it does have, we can say, like a family resemblance with the idea of Sercon. Yeah.
John?
Thank you, David, for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. First of all, I would like to introduce biology. And today we have different scholars conducting researches about how our biology change or generate different behaviors in our body just because we spend more time with others. For example, we know, following this research, that parents spending more time with children change their biological disposition to stay with others and cultivate behaviors or way of being with others different. For example, they take care of others in a different way, they take care of things in a different way just because their body generates hormones such as oxytocin and not other hormones such as testosterone in the case of men. Then my point is, but I don't know, it's a big question, is when you talk about being with, you try to, or you place the ethical and epistemic dimension. Is this possible to place as biological dimension when we talk about being with? And the other question is about identities. We have many scholars talking about how important is identity, and sometimes they place identity in the center of teaching. I know that is not your case because it's very clear that you didn't talk about identity, but this is a huge debate. Even probably it's bigger the debate in the States because if we take into consideration the colonial perspective on education and so on, the possibility to develop an identity as the center of teaching is something very, very important. But I would like to know what is the place of identities in your philosophy of education?
So John is asking for what is there a biological dimension of being with? That's the first question. And then the second was, can you remind me?
About identities.
Yeah, so what's the place of identity in this being with?
Do we have enough time to answer you? Those are two wonderful, wonderful questions, John. Thank you for that. The first one, our biology, and so much research, of course, going on in neuroscience in our time, and that's going to continue. In fact, my wife is a molecular biologist, and she does a lot of research on some of these issues that are in your question, I think. I think we have to say, of course, biology is a condition. Biology, each of us, we have a condition, and it gives us certain, you might say, possibilities, but also certain limitations. And each of us is completely unique in terms of our biological and neurological makeup. So it's a condition we have to live with. The interesting question becomes, to what extent does it determine what we do? To what extent does my biology or my neurobiology determine what I say? To what extent does it determine what I think? To what extent does it determine what I feel? And here connects with the question of identity. To what extent does my race, my gender, my class, my religion, my everything, to what extent does that determine what I say and how I say it and what I say or what I don't say, etc., etc., etc. So I think what I'm doing, John, is I'm taking your question and I'm pressing a very challenging issue at the heart of education is what are I would call it, our degrees of freedom. What are our degrees of freedom? To what extent are we determined by our cultural background, identity in that sense? And to what extent are we determined by our biology, the interior and the exterior, the inner and the outer? And of course, the debate is endless. There's very little agreement on the extent to which these factors influence us. To me, I think as a philosopher, the kind of move that I sometimes make with my students is I say, okay, let's put up on the wall all of these interpretations of who and what we are. Okay, we're a biological entity. We're a cultural identity. We're a psychological identity. We're a religious entity. All of the different descriptions that have been given about you and me. So I put them all up. And then I walk to the other end of the room and I say, where am I? Those descriptions are over there. They're over there. In which, am I standing in one of them? But if I'm standing in it, how can I know that how can I put it out there? If I'm determined by it, how can I hold it out in my hand? Because if I hold it out in my hand, I'm no longer determined. I now have a critical relationship with that claim. I don't know if this makes sense to you all, but the question is, it's a big one, and I think both of your questions, in a wonderful way, point to that, our degrees of freedom as teachers and as students. I would claim we have not done enough work in education to really understand our degrees of freedom. We sometimes get so occupied with the forces that seemingly determine us, and we sort these out and say, well, this influence is more important than that influence. Well, yes, we should do that work. But it's very interesting, I think, when you think about being an individual teacher in a classroom of students, whatever the mix is, migrant students, indigenous, whatever. My relationship with them, what are the degrees of freedom I have in my relationship? What is the lens that I'm going to look at my students through? Will it be all of these descriptions of what they are? Should I look at them through those descriptions? Or is there another way? And one last comment, very old concept in philosophy having to do with this notion of freedom. The question is, are we capable of spontaneity? Are we capable of actual spontaneity? Or as the French say, les jeux sont faits déjà, or all the die is the die cast already? I think we are being spontaneous in an important way right here. I don't know if anyone believes that, but do we have time for one more?
Thank you very much, David. First of all, I got many questions, but I'll try to narrow it to one. I really like how you explain the verb to heed, when you say not only to attend or to note someone, but also to respect and take seriously that which has called out for attentiveness. I don't find a word in Spanish for that, because we distinguish from to listen and to hear maybe to someone, but not with the verb to attend, which is curious for me, but I really like how that also takes already into that being with starts with the other, and not only with yourself, kind of simultaneously, I think. And my question, to narrow it down a little bit, would be, how can teachers or like people starting to be a teacher, I believe this is a process of creating your own agency as well as a teacher in the world, and how you put that into the classroom, how can you develop some kind of, I don't want to say the word competences, but some kind of predisposition of your mind and body in order to start when you go to school and start being with at the first moment, even though knowing that that's a process that you learn when you are doing it. But there must be something that in universities or as in here you can teach pre-service teachers in order to be ready for that. Let's say.
Do you want to do that in English? Or?
That's gonna be difficult, Pablo. So
How can you teach that?
how can you teach being with, considering that you have to train a pre-service teacher? How, yeah.
Gracias, Pablo. That's another wonderful question. Really great to think about these things together. And Pablo was using at one moment the English verb heed. It's H-E-E-D, and I don't know if there's a direct translation, but it's a verb that means to, in the same moment, to listen, to see, to feel. It's a very beautiful English verb, and it's very apropos of this idea of being with, and attention, as we were saying. So, how do you begin as a new teacher to cultivate this kind of awareness, this kind of mindfulness, all that we've been saying? A few things I would say. Maybe the most important is to try to remember, as a beginning teacher, what moments in your life did you feel the deepest sense of wonder? Try and remember, if you can, moments beginning as a child where you felt the deepest sense of wonder, and analyze those moments. Really try to get as far into those moments as you can, as memory allows you. Really think through, what were those moments like? What were you wondering at? What sparked your wonder? What triggered your wonder? So that you can reopen your sense of wonder. Maybe it's biological, I don't know, but as we grow older, we forget to wonder. We become so set in our habits and customs and everything, we just forget to wonder. So I think to begin the journey of becoming a teacher, try to remember those moments of wonder. And then, I think Laura emphasized this in her commentary on my presentation, the notion of getting in touch with what are the sources of inspiration that make you feel the most deeply as a human being, that make you feel the most deeply. A brief example, in my first faculty position, I was in Chicago at the University of Illinois, and I was director of a teacher education program, like here at the Facultad de Educación. One of the first things that I would do with the men and women preparing to become teachers is I would create an assignment. They had to go to the main art museum in Chicago. It's called the Art Museum. I hope one day you can all go to Chicago. It's a fantastic art museum. Not quite the Prado, but it's very good. It's a small Prado, but it's really wonderful. I would ask them, each of them, to go to the museum, and it was free, gratis, so it's no problem. And to go to the museum and walk the hallways. Just walk slowly through the hallways until you realize that you've stopped. Until you suddenly realize you've stopped in front of something, painting, sculpture, whatever it may be. And then start thinking about, why did I stop here? Why did I stop at this painting after I was walking by so many? Why did I stop at this sculpture after I was walking by so many? Try to come up with an answer about why you stopped. And then a couple of days later, they would meet as a group, like 5 or 6 of them, and they would each sort of teach each other why they stopped at that work of art. And it's a simple exercise, but it really opened up the sense of perceptivity, perception, and how connected perception is to feeling, and how connected perception is to feeling and thinking. So it really began to open up themselves. And as simple an exercise as it is, I have gotten testimony from students, this is quite some years ago, that was the most important moment of their teacher education. They built everything else upon that. The sense of awareness, mindfulness, appreciation, asombro, wonder, and everything. So it's a wonderful question. How do you get underway as a teacher here? But it's very simple to say, but remember everything human. Just remember everything human that we are. That's It's really, I think, central. Because when you get to be with your children or the adolescents, whoever they are, first and last, you're human beings together. And you're going to be, living your life. What is it now? Almost 6? If you were in a classroom right now, you would be living your life, right? You'd be alive. So live with your students. Live with them during the time that you're together. Yeah.
We have time for a very, very small question. Super small.
Okay, I want to ask that now we are living in a kind of standardized society where we don't have enough time to do what we have to do. That also we don't have time to really get to know the other. And actually, when we get to know the others and we realize about their social conditions and their social difficulties, we somehow feel some kind of grief or harm that produce some kind of worry or tend to push us to avoid this encounter because it produces us harm or grief. So maybe in this kind of situation, looking from a cultural framework, this proposal would be more situated in a cultural proposal, subcultural proposal, or contracultural proposal. As I mean, being with sounds a really nice way to develop our identity as teachers and share this space with the others. But also sounds kind of utopic in this social condition that we are living right now.
Okay, yeah. Muchas gracias. Yeah, that's another wonderful question. Utopic vision. Yes and no, I would say. Yes, there is dimensions of an ideal here that I mentioned in my presentation. It's almost like an ideal for teachers to think about. And as an ideal, we can never get there. The ideal is not the real. But I think this ideal that I've been sharing is rooted in the real. It doesn't begin in the clouds, even though some of my talk was in the clouds. It begins here on earth in face-to-face encounter. And that's very important. That's why I don't think at the end of the day it is utopic. I think it's happening all the time. Every time, with all the dedicated teachers I've seen in my time, whatever the subject, whatever the level of grade, whatever the composition of the class, I think this kind of connectivity. But your question is helpful because the way that the world works, the way the world is presented to us in the news and everything else, this everyday quality that I think is real in many classrooms is invisible, except to the individual teacher and her students. It's invisible. We don't see it. All we see is polarization. All we see is incredible racism and sexism and violence, and just it's an ocean wave of violence, which can make us feel. This is why I think your question, now that I think about it, I think I've heard many students at different grade levels ask a question like this. It's why it can seem very fruitless or very, how is it going to make a difference? I think the last thing I would say is, it makes all the difference. And it makes all the difference because if we can be with students this way and with each other as teachers this way, we are showing each other every moment a counter-example. We're showing each other every single moment a counter-example to the violence that is all around us. And if we can remember these moments, keep them as fresh as we can in ourselves, then we begin to develop the resources, the strength, the belief, the faith that can allow us to become maybe more actors at broader political platforms. Because one of the problems about activism, and this is familiar to all of us, sometimes the activists are very preachy. They really don't want to listen. They want to tell. They don't want to listen to us. This perspective, I think, can prepare us to come into the world actively, but remember to listen as well as to speak. So it's a very brief answer to a very big question. I think all of my answers have been, I'm sorry, very brief to these big questions, but muchas gracias. Lovely philosophical afternoon.